We have a lot to talk about, so let's not waste any time. Hi, I'm Dan, and this is my review of Doctor Who Season 1. Or Season 14, whatever the hell it's called. I can't keep track anymore. So yeah, it's something a little bit different. Now, historically, I have done individual episode reviews for that when the new series comes out, when new episodes come out, which I've been doing since the Chibnall era, and also for the 60th stuff. But because I sort of ran out of steam with that kind of format, I decided to do something different for Ncuti Gatwa's first season as a Doctor, which Series 1, Season 14. I don't know what it's called anymore, but I thought I'd do something a little bit like what I do with my Inside Number 9 series reviews, where I cover like the whole season as a whole and go through each episode sort of in its own little segment, and then at the end do a little ranking and whatnot and talk about it beforehand. But yeah, I thought I'd do that for this series. It's something different, and I want to just see if it works, and if it does work out, and if it, if it works out, I will continue doing it this way. But if it doesn't, that's for future me to decide. Now, going into this season, I had very high hopes. I was more looking forward to this than the 60th specials, honestly, because, Ncuti and Millie, and this new era, it felt like it was going to be something fresh. Even though it's from Russell D Davies, he's a very different writer from what he was when he left in 2010. So I was expecting something of, very new, very fresh, a different tone. And coming out of the series, I've got to say it's a very uneven series. There's ups and downs. There's a lot going on. A lot of the whole series arc kind of stuff, like with the Susan Twist and Mrs. Flood and who Ruby's parents are and whatnot, that was kind of established in the Christmas special. So yeah, overall I would say it's a very uneven series that does honestly fall into a lot of the trappings that a lot of the older RTD series could fall into sometimes. But overall, I'm leaning towards thinking it's a good series. I overall would say I enjoyed it for the most part. And I think the main source of my enjoyment was the Doctor-companion dynamic. Ncuti Gatwa already, I think, stole the show. I think he was I was really excited to see what he would do with the role. And I think there's something about his performance that just throughout the series, really, that feels effortless. He's so charismatic and charming. He can also be very dramatic when the story requires it. There's some really real highlights in terms of certain moments that really stick out in terms of his dramatic chops. I think really good. And his chemistry with Millie Gibson is fantastic. For a young actor, I think she's really great. And, it'd be great to see her experience grow as a result of Doctor Who. I think, again, she's had some really excellent moments and stories to shine. And their dynamic is so genuine and so winning that it can make even some of the weaker stories at least watchable. I don't hate any episode in the season. And obviously this series definitely went for a more lighter, fantastical tone. And while I do think that can hinder some of the character drama, I think a lot of people mention that, it can hinder some of the character drama. It does feel a little too safe in terms of, they never sort of clash, like the Doctor and Ruby never sort of clash. I think this series does what Chibnall tried to do with The Fan a lot better, because they never really argued. It was always that they're always, besties and the Doctor's great and whatnot. I think because the chemistry is absolutely here and it's magnetic and it's electric and it's all these positive things I can say, I think I still enjoy it, even though hopefully in season 2 and beyond they can challenge that dynamic a bit more. But I enjoyed it for the most part, and I think it was what the Chibnall era tried to do with the companions, but better. In fact, I really think it does show up what the Chibnall era fell short of in the sense of, looking back in comparison to this series, the Chibnall era felt very fun deficient. It felt very serious a lot of the time, which was very at odds with how Jodie was trying to play the Doctor as this sort of eccentric, quirky, almost David Tennant, Matt Smith-esque kind of portrayal. That felt really at odds, and it just never felt natural. The humour always felt very scripted and just unnatural, whereas here, the tone that the RTD was going for, as well as Ncuti and Millie's performance and chemistry, it went hand in hand in a way, and I think it just felt natural. The humour, the dialogue, it felt almost like improv at points, and I overall had a good time with it, and I think there was a real sense of conviction, definitely towards the start. I think towards the end it did sort of filter out a little bit. I just wasn't too keen on some of the later episodes of the season, but I think initially it really started strong. There was a real sense of conviction and confidence in the writing and the storytelling. I think there was a real sort of, this is what Doctor Who is now, this bold, kind of more fantastical, as I say, Nero, that was trying to be more fun. I really enjoyed that about it. So now I'm going to review each episode from Space Babies to Empire of Death. Going to go through all 8 episodes of the season, just talking about them, and then overall at the end I'll give like a ranking of best to worst and whatnot. And yeah, so here are my opinions on Doctor Who Season 1, or Series 14. Now, every year this happens. Every year there's a new episode that is often already decided by the fandom as like the new worst episode ever. You know, previously it was Legend of the Sea Devils, then it was Orphan 55, and then I was going to say Arachnid in the UK, but Series 11 has about 3 options that it could be. But it happens every year. There's always a new episode that's so bad it's like the new worst episode. And Space Babies, the series opener, is the next in line of that trend that's been going on pretty much for the whole of actually all of Doctor Who really. And yeah, it's a bit of a crap episode, but it's nowhere near the level of like Legend of the Sea Devils or Orphan 55. It's just a bit of a crappy little run around, but it's not offensively bad. And there are things that I do like in this episode, mainly Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson's chemistry. It's they have a really fun, effortless, charming dynamic. I also really like the butterfly effect open. I think that's a really nice, playful little scene that sets the tone quite well for the era. And I think the episode does have some decent ideas. There's some interesting like commentary on like abortion and healthcare, privatization, all that kind of stuff. And the idea that I actually found most interesting, which could have been explored more, it was to do with the bogeyman monster, which was designed specifically to be scary, like its frequency of like the scream and whatnot. I like that idea of the kind of it being a construct to be intentionally scary and how fiction helps to develop, babies' brains like in this episode, But they didn't really explore that. And in fact, they didn't really explore a lot in this episode. A lot of these, social commentary bits and those ideas that I mentioned earlier, they just sort of paid lip service to. They don't really explore them in much depth. And ultimately, it's a very hollow experience when you think back on it. And really, it is just a run around on a space station. I mean, how many times have we seen that in Doctor Who before? And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think this episode clearly wants to be a showcase for Ncuti and Millie's chemistry, which is fine. Their chemistry is really good. But that's what the Church of Ruby Road was for, the Christmas special. So that episode, that gets away with it because that's the intention of the episode as their introduction story. But also, even outside that, it's still a really entertaining little Christmas caper. But with Space Babies, now that the dynamic is set up, you've got to have the stories now. You can't just rely on that. You can expand on it, but you can't just rely on it. But that's what this episode does, and that's why, ultimately, it's just a really hollow run around that just isn't really that great. And I think the Space Babies idea, it's a cool idea, but in execution, I don't think it's very well realised. Like, kind of, the way that the mouth moves, it has a bit of, uncanny valley effect. It just doesn't look right, especially with the voiceover, the voice acting, and also the baby's expressions, they just don't come together as a whole, and it's very unconvincing and just feels a bit cheap and tacky. I personally wasn't a fan of this one, so a 4 out of 10, and I probably would say it's the weakest. It is a bit tacky and a bit crap, but we've had worse. Now, my parents love the phrase an acquired taste, particularly when they're describing bits of media that isn't for them. Like Inside Number 9, here their son absolutely loves it, but for them it's an acquired taste. And if there's any Doctor Who episode that I could ever describe as being an acquired taste, it would be The Devil's Chord. And I perfectly understand why a lot of people weren't fans of this episode. I perfectly understand that. But for me, I stick to my guns. I had an absolute blast with this one. It's not perfect by any stretch, but I had a lot of fun because it was really, it appealed to my own tastes. I love musicals. I love the 1960s sort of vibe and aesthetic. So I was naturally going to love this one. I really enjoyed it. I mean, first of all, the production design of the 1960s, I loved it. I love Ncuti and Millie's outfits. I love that. It's all great. I love the vibe of, the area. They go to Abbey Road and meet the Beatles, even though they don't look anything like the Beatles. It's not too big of a deal for me, even though they don't really do anything in the episode. They just sort of window dressing, but I don't know, I just like the vibe of the episode. I think Maestro, Jinx Monsoon, was a great bombastic villain, and Jinx Monsoon did give a really deliciously camp evil performance. And I think it's appropriate for this episode. I think the tone, it's pantomime-esque, but I think it works here. And, I think there is a sort of very petty childishness to Maestro. I think that's why I find them quite compelling. I think it's quite interesting. Yes, they are this all-powerful god of music, but they're also very petty and very bitter towards the toy maker, who's their father. I like that kind of, I like that extra little dimension. And I think the theme of what the world would be like without music and kind of the impact of music, I think, is quite interesting. It reminded me, this is a bit of a tangent here, but it reminded me there was this episode of Family Guy that did a sort of similar gag where Brian and Stewie, they travel the multiverse and they enter a universe where Frank Sinatra was never born, so he couldn't use his influence and cultural influence because of his music to get John F. Kennedy elected. So he didn't get elected, so he didn't solve the Cuban Missile Crisis, which caused this nuclear fallout. And I don't know, it just reminded me a bit of that. They read in the newspapers of these different countries attacking each other, and then obviously they go back to the present where very Pyramids of Mars-esque, that London is all desolate and destroyed, and I love that idea. I think it's a very cool idea. And the episode does have a very playful tone in this sort of way. Like, it's like lines like the I thought it was diegetic, or that line from Ncuti. I thought that was really cool. And it was a very fun episode. I enjoyed the battle between the Doctor and Maestro and whatnot. I love the bit when it all goes silent. That's really cool. I love that. And then there's always a twist at the end with the song at the end, the big musical number. I know a lot of people were not fans of this. Me personally, I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's a musical episode. You get all these musical elements. I think a musical number is warranted, but also because that Maestro has suppressed music for decades, I don't see it as too much of a stretch that, you know, everything would all sort of come back in a big, unrealistic musical song and dance number that does feel jarring. I think but in the context of the story, I think it's appropriate. And I've got to be honest, I love that sort of twist sort of music. I love of that era of the 60s, but it's such a catchy song. I really, really like it. And so, I really enjoyed this one. Like 8 out of 10 for me. It's not perfect, but it's just a really fun one. Maybe a bit of a guilty pleasure story, but I just really enjoyed it personally. Next up, we have my favourite episode of the series, bar none, Boom, the return of Stephen Moffat in the writing chair. And I love his writing style, and this story really feels like a 12th Doctor story, and you know how much I love the 12th Doctor era, so this is great for me. But it's the kind of proper, you know, sci-fi that you'd find in that era that I really love, and that's that tone. I love it. It was a simple premise revolving around the landmine, you know, very reminiscent of that one scene from Genesis of the Daleks, but with a great sci-fi reworking and some great themes of like capitalism in there, like great critiques of that sort of stuff with the ambulances and the mine and the sort of, you know, war for profit. And, you know, it's all really compelling stuff. And this is the kind of thing, RTD and stuff like Space Movies wasn't really saying an awful lot. Here, Moffat's here with the commentary, really. It's great, you know. I thought the ambulance robots were pretty funky, a villain. They were quite creepy. And it was nice to have like Susan Twist, who had been popping up here and there. It was nice for her, to have a more prominent role as the sort of face of the ambulance. That was quite cool. And I love those like AI reconstructions of the deceased, you know, the thoughts and prayers thing. It's very like almost like sickly sweet, but very, you know, disingenuous. It was, you know, death for business and all that. You know, Moffat did this a lot in his era, and you know, it's great to see it back again, especially after Kablam from the Chibnall era. And it does that with these ideas of like AI and whatnot, and sort of the faces of the deceased being used in that sort of way, and kind of the whole things of identity. It almost felt very Blade Runner-esque. I love Blade Runner. There's a lot of texture in this story in the script, but also visually in the production design. It's a very well-made episode. It looks gorgeous. I love, you know, the volume screen for the most part. There's the odd shot here that looks iffy, but that's really not a deal breaker. And the practical sets and the lighting and the costumes and all the set design in the base that you don't see for very long, but it's a really meticulously done. And this episode really just had me in terms of like emotionally edge on your seat stuff. You know, there's some really, you know, compelling, like obviously the premise of the Doctor at the start stepping on the landmine, and that instigates the rest of the drama in the episode. It's really, really good stuff. Ncuti Gatwa gives a fantastic performance, probably one of his better performances in the whole series, like consistently throughout the episode. And of course there is that danger that obviously, you know, the landmine will kill him, but if he, you know, reacts too much, if he gets too overly emotional, it'll detect it and it'll blow him up as well. You know, these stakes gradually build up, and then you have stuff like when Ruby sort of fake out death in a way, even though obviously we know she's not going to die because there's 5 episodes left to go or whatever. It's still really strong because it's shocking. You really don't see it coming, but the circumstances of how she got there, it makes sense. It's logical, and the Doctor's reaction. He's in pain and anguish at that sight of her, but he can't do anything, and he can't even react overly emotional, because if he does, the mine will detect it and he'll blow up. It's just so well done. And honestly, the climax, even though it is a little bit of a, you know, love conquers all, honestly, I really love how it was done, and it got me very sentimental. I think, yeah, I loved it. And the side casts as well, they were enjoyable. You know, they weren't anything amazing, but I think they worked for what the story was going for. They were just normal. They were just endearing. I just enjoyed it. Honestly, this is just my kind of Doctor Who. I love what the episode was going for, and yes, there may be things you can critique, but overall, it was the most that I got out of an episode. I felt so many things, and that's the best. I think that's the best sort of stories that you can have, where they make you feel every emotion under the sun. That's what Boom did for me. So I'm giving it a 10. It's time for our annual experimental Doctor Who story with 73 yards, which from the moment it started, with the lack of the opening titles and just the title appearing on screen, I knew we were in for something special. And It's not a perfect episode, as I've thought about it more since broadcast. It definitely doesn't quite hold up. But when this story really hits, and when it hits a stride with some of the character stuff, particularly with Ruby, it crushes. It's genuinely phenomenal stuff sometimes. So it starts off as a bit of a folk horror kind of thing in Wales and the Welsh countryside. The Doctor's completely out of the picture this one. It's Ruby's time to shine. Millie Gibson is phenomenal in this episode. Her best performance, bar none. And the fact that this is the first episode she filmed is incredible, I think. But, Ruby exploring this, sort of ominous Welsh town. There's some brilliant direction and craft, like the cinematography is like some great canted angles and some really good horror, like ominous, foreboding lighting. I think it's really effective. The atmosphere in the pub, it kind of plays into little sort of Welsh stereotypes of kind of like countryside stereotypes in a playful way ultimately, because when the dude comes in with a pasty tray and there's like the light, the shot becomes lighter, and it's quite playful in that way, and it's nice. But there's still that lingering sense of uncomfortableness because Ruby is on her own. She doesn't quite know what she's doing, even though they're not a haunted pub or anything. They're not a haunted tavern. That feeling of uncomfortableness with Ruby, it doesn't go away immediately, because she has to go back home, without the Doctor's help. She has to leave the Doctor, and then she loses pretty much everything from that point on. Like, because of the mysterious old woman who makes everybody run away when they talk to her, she loses her mother, who we've seen has been very protective of her in the previous episodes. So that's a real gut punch. And then the one that really got me, I think, as a Doctor Who fan, when Kate appears, you think initially, oh, some reassurance, because this episode was very, in a good way, very un-Doctor Who. So when Kate shows up in unit to sort of solve this a year later, it's like, oh yeah, this is great, finally Ruby's safe now, But even they can't stop the mysterious lady, and that's when it really goes like, oh, that's when the dread sets in, and the stuff that Ruby has to go through all these years and pass by, 20 odd years pass by. It's just she has to just let go of it all, and it's like she can't, but she has to, and it's really compelling stuff. Now the political stuff with Roger Ap William, I think it's not perfect. I think the episode did need more time to breathe. I think maybe make it an hour long, cut a little bit off of the folk horror stuff and dedicate a bit more to the political stuff. So I think weave it in a bit more in that sort of montage of Ruby getting older. I think it needs to be woven in a bit better and set up a bit more. But I still think it's pretty cool, and I love the bit in Cardiff Stadium when Ruby uses the whole 73 yards with the old woman against Roger, and I love that. It's very cathartic. But I think it could have been even better had they just had a bit more time to breathe. The bit with the older Ruby in the hospital and meeting the old woman comes down, and then it's all kind of circular thing where Ruby was the old woman and whatnot, and warning her younger self. It's a little bit confusing, but it works to a degree. I can kind of roll with it. And the reason why is because of what it puts Ruby through. I think it's so, what it puts Ruby through, this journey that she goes on, I think is really compelling. I think it's really well done. Millie Gibson acts her socks off, and I think I'm going to go with an 8 out of 10, a very high 8 out of 10, like 8.5-ish, sort of that kind of. It's a really strong episode, and the emotions it made me feel, again, a bit like Boom, the emotions it made me feel, it was brilliantly done. It sticks out, but just some of the lapses in logic can be a bit, maybe not the best. Unlike 73 Yards, which did get a little bit weaker the more I thought about it, Dot and Bubble got better the more I thought about it. I think this is a story that, again, a bit like Boom, is very much to my taste of that kind of futuristic sci-fi sort of storytelling. And I really love this episode. I love what it was going for. I'm a big fan of dystopian sci-fi kind of stories. I love these sort of stories. I love Blade Runner. I love Metropolis. I've been going through the Mad Max films recently. I've been going through the Planet of the Apes films recently. I just love those kind of stories. And I love what Dot and Bubble does, that kind of very sickly sweet, perfect society, which hides a very dark, sinister undertone. I really like those kind of stories. And I also like how these kind of stories can play around with like modern social dynamics and whatnot. I mean, in this case, obviously it's social media. I mean, I gave the example just then of the Planet of the Apes films. I've been watching through the originals, the original Charlton Heston ones from the 60s, and that original one, that's very influenced by sort of more countercultural beliefs of the 60s, sort of going against the norm. You can feel that in that original 68 film. And in this, obviously, they tackle social media, and it can provide some strong humour, like when Lindy's just very ineffectual, she can't walk without the bubble, she bangs into a lamppost and such. But it also provides a strong commentary on how social media now can get us from A in the present to Z in this future where people just can't operate. And, I think it's just a genuinely really interesting, insightful little commentary on the on the state of our world. I think it's realised very well as well. You know, the production design. I love the set of like Lindy's room with those like, you know, yellows and oranges and those kind of vibrant colours and whatnot, and like the sort of the ground, like the courtyard. I think it's really well made episode. I love those like slug monsters. They kind of quite nasty looking and a little bit cheesy, but I think well judged. I was also really impressed with that bubble effect that's around I keep calling her Lindy's head, sorry. It's really well done, and the fact that it's consistently strong throughout the episode, I think it's really well achieved. I mean, this is a story that RTD apparently has had in his mind since the Stephen Moffat years, since like Matt Smith's era, which apparently they couldn't do because of like the lack of budget. But I think with the increased Disney budget, I think you can feel the ambition stretched in a good way. I think it's really really cool what they realise. I think the synthy sort of score, I think, added to that futuristic-y, perfect atmosphere. And then Lindy as well, who we are very much aligned with in this episode. The Doctor and Ruby, they take a back seat. Sorry, they're very much on Lindy's screen. They pop up here and there and again, and they're fun, you know, to have around. But I like how we are very much aligned with Lindy. We very much follow the story through her eyes, and we see it from the beginning and whatnot. And yeah, we do see how she is very incompetent. She's very ineffectual because of how she's been brought up. But I think that does almost endear us to him, because it's sort of like, well, it's not really her fault. That's just how life's always been for her, you know. And you do think, you know, when she meets Ricky September, who is a Chad, he was, when they go off and try and solve the mystery and whatnot, you think, okay, there's possibly room for her to grow and change, and you do feel sort of endeared to her in a way. And then she betrays Ricky, you know, by just selling him out to the little evil Dot and Bubble that kills him. You know, it's cold, it's really shocking, but you do understand why she's done that, because ultimately, no, she's lived this kind of life where she cannot progress in that way, and she will just do anything in a selfish way to save her own skin. And then when she finds all the others and the Doctor and Ruby are there, the Doctor knows that she's completely lying. And you can tell in his face that he knows that she's lying. And then they completely reject his offer to save them and whatnot, and they all go out to their deaths. Now, there's a lot, obviously, that you can read into this ending. I think, first of all, as well, Ncuti's performance is he like rage at the end. I think is really a highlight of his era. I think it's really, really great. And there's also a lot of ideas of there's like the racial aspect, which I'm not qualified to go into really, but I do think it's interesting. I recommend like checking out what other people have to say. But I do think that's an interesting idea. But even outside of that, I think you can still look at this in the context of not everybody is worthy of being saved. And for a character like the Doctor, who is so open-minded about everyone, you know, how he offers to save Lindy and the rest of them, and they just reject him because of that. I think you really feel that anguish that the Doctor feels, because it's like their arrogance is just, it's really, really well done. See, I'm going to give this one a 9 out of 10. This is a story that really connected with me. I think it was just a really strong one. I really enjoyed it. It's some great ideas and themes and a great tone and vibe that I personally really enjoyed. Episode 6, Rogue, aka Doctor Who does Bridgerton, and they make sure to remind you of that several times in the episode. Cards on the table, I don't watch Bridgerton. In fact, I don't really care for a lot of those period dramas and, you know, Regency sort of set stories. So ultimately, it wasn't going to be my thing from the get-go, but, you know, some episodes in the past have convinced me. You know, my mum brought up, you like Girl in the Fireplace? And I was like, yeah, I do, but it's a really well-written story, and the sci-fi elements are cool. Haunted of Erdidati, I love that one because of the sort of Frankenstein Cyberman twist and whatnot. You know, they can work if they're compelling, but this one just didn't compel me. I found a lot of it very meandering and that sort of... It's well made, you know, the costumes, the production design, the sets, though it's all well done, like in terms of a practical production sense. Well made, but I don't care for that tone. I don't care for that kind of gossiping about relationships and drama and I don't care about that kind of stuff, and it just eats away time at several points in the episode. I just don't connect with that kind of tone. I just don't, and it is more of a me thing, this was, but because of how much is spent on that kind of tone, it was just such a passive experience to watch this episode. I just didn't feel a damn thing. I just thought that the bird monster things, that weird owl cosplay monsters, were they a bit stupid. I mean, they look daft. I mean, one of them looked like a bloody pigeon, but I think the whole thing of the way they're like cosplaying this era, it was like, what? I don't get what they were going for with them. Ruby I was quite let down by, because she didn't do a damn thing in this episode, and also her fake out death when she was like, she was going to be like assimilated by the aliens. It was like, it was really stupid because it's the second time that we've had a Ruby fake out death, and you can't pull the fake out companion death card twice in the same series. And also, like, the execution, it just really was really not compelling. It was just, I didn't believe the whole how Ruby got out of the situation. I just didn't believe it. So that leaves us with the Doctor and new character Rogue, played by Jonathan Groff, who I thought, this is the main strong point of the episode. I do think that Ncuti Gatwa and Jonathan Groff are really great actors. They did have some good chemistry, and there's some really nice moments with them, like with a bit in Rogue Spaceship when they start just playing Kylie Minogue in a kind of that I enjoyed that a little bit. That was quite fun. And when they go into the TARDIS and the Doctor starts singing Pure Imagination, that was kind of cool. That's it. They have good chemistry, and it's probably better than some other Doctor Who romances like Phasmin or Ten and Rose. Even I don't like Ten and Rose. And I used to be a bit of a prune to romance in Doctor Who, and now I'm more willing to give it a shot if it's well written and compelling. And the chemistry was there, but ultimately I don't really think the romance went anywhere meaningful. Like their big kiss at the end, it was just sort of a ploy for Rogue to distract the aliens so he could save Ruby from that like weird triangle thing, and they all bloody get sent into some time vortex. It's like, that's it. That's the payoff to this romance. It's like, it's just, nah, didn't do it for me. Also, I do find it strange that the Doctor is attracted to a Rogue who's a bounty hunter who kills people for money. That just doesn't seem very Doctor-y, if I'm being honest. But yeah, a very mediocre episode. I understand why people do enjoy this one. It's a bit simpler, and I can understand that, because some of the other episodes have been very out there and different, but this one it was just a resounding meh from me, so 5 out of 10. The penultimate episode now, The Legend of Ruby Sunday, setting up the big finale. We're back at Unit, and that's quite nice to see. It's a well put together episode. The production is very strong. I think you can feel the bigger budget with come back to Unit after the 60th stuff. You can feel the increased budget here. It's nice to see Mel again and whatnot. And I have to say, it was entertaining in the moment. I enjoyed this, particularly the big standout for me was the whole time window set piece. That was a really great sci-fi concept. I think it was well realised. I think it's very effective at, engaging you more in the kind of mystery of Ruby's parents. But reflecting back on this episode, even before Empire of Death had broadcast, this is just pure setup and does not hold up on its own merits. The thing is, you have other part ones to a finale, in years gone by, like Bad Wolf, The Stolen Earth, Army of Ghosts. I'm not even a big fan of the Series 2 finale, but Army of Ghosts is a strong part one. It stands well on its own, even if I'm not a fan of the second part. Legend of Ruby Sunday, it just doesn't hold up because you don't have any actual story. It's just mostly still just teasing the audience of like who Susan Triad is. All these red herrings about Susan and the TARDIS, and then ultimately Sutek, and it's like, I'm a fan who knows all this stuff, so what a casual audience member is going to make of this? I have no idea. Also, isn't this supposed to be a big reboot? It's season 1, isn't this meant to be a big reboot with the Disney thing? What a new viewer's going to think of this? Because this episode just doesn't really tell a story. It doesn't tell its own story. It's just more teasing and mystery boxes and all that stuff. It just doesn't really answer any questions. And I was thinking as well with the whole Susan Triad thing, she's been popping up throughout the series. And I do like how she's been popping up and whatnot. But in terms of her Susan Triad character, she's a tech genius. We don't actually find out what she does. Like, what is it that she actually does? We don't find out. And then, of course, there's the reveal of Sutek, which was very much going to live and die on how he was implemented in the finale. And spoiler alert, he was implemented in a very piss-poor manner. So this cliffhanger just doesn't hold any weight, even if it's cool to see the kind of the creepy, possessed makeup. That was kind of cool. And the whole Sutek's gift of death, that was a pretty cool cliffhanger, like the kind of homage to like a classic style cliffhanger. But yeah, this was just like a nothing burger. It was more like Survivors of the Flux, to be honest. It was just filler before the finale. I mean, you don't want that, do you? So 4 out of 10, like just a really weak nothing episode. And then our finale, Empire of Death, which is just such a weak, underwhelming finale. That it's Russell's weakest finale that he's ever done, like even beating Doomsday for me, which I'm personally not a big fan of anyway. Yeah, this is definitely weaker for me. It really does fall into the trapping of just making the stakes so big. Like, Sutek literally Thanos' everybody. All the unit staff die, everyone in London dies, all the Sunday family dies because of this. He basically just does a Thanos snap and everyone dusts away and whatnot. It's a cool visual. I like the little moped chase at the start and the dusty sand storm in London. That's kind of cool. And the desolation that's caused across the universe, again, it's cool, but it just raises the stakes too high. Like when the gang vanished, I didn't feel a damn thing. It's like, oh, they'll be all right. We'll hit the reset button at the end. Because I've been there before. This is what Russell does. He always does the reset button. Like, we can never have characters die. Like there's no stakes, and I think that's where the more light-hearted stuff just doesn't really translate well, because you have the god of death, Sutek, and none of the mainstays get killed. And Sutek is one of the best villains of the Tom Baker, of just the classic series actually, and he's done a massive disservice here. Like the design, I think, is a bit crap. Like the CG design is just really not very good for me personally. But he doesn't do anything. He just sits around the TARDIS in the desolate unit base and then gets dragged across the time vortex, and he doesn't do anything. So for a diehard sado like me, who went and marathoned the entire Tom Baker era last year and watched Pyramids of Mars again and absolutely adored it and worships that story because it's a masterpiece, right? I wasn't very happy with how Sutek was handled. So what a casual audience member is going to make of this when, you bring this one character back who appeared once in the mid-1970s. What are they going to make of all this? And also with it being alienated and the whole memory TARDIS thing from that Tales from the TARDIS spin-off when they brought back the old classic Doctors for the 60th. Like, you're relying on that for your finale. Like, that's not a good move. There are some good ideas, I think. I like the whole idea of the Doctor's travelled so far, like he's so old and he's travelled so far, that if a villain like Sutek were to use that against him, the consequences would be catastrophic and they'd be far-reaching. That's a really effective quite melancholic idea, but it just doesn't have the weight that it really should. So I'm being pretty negative on this story, but there is one thing that really does redeem it just a little bit, that it doesn't make me hate the story, and that's the last 10 minutes when we find out who Ruby's mother actually was, and it turns out she was a normal person. Now, putting aside some of the lapses in logic of like, well, how couldn't they find her? Because we gave her importance, so that's why we couldn't find her. Why was Sutek interested in her? Why did she point at Ruby Road and that's how she named her daughter, even though nobody's there? Putting aside some of those lapses in logic of how you get to that point, I love the fact that it is just a normal person. Because it would have been really, really cheap and tacky and just cliche to have another sci-fi grandiose chosen one narrative. You don't need to have that. It just cheapens it. And so when Ruby finally meets her mother in the cafe, it's such a beautifully done scene. It's beautifully acted. When the Sunday family, when they invite her into their lives, bring her into their lives, that's great. And when the Doctor and Ruby part ways and they say goodbye, it's all brilliantly acted stuff because it is so rooted in real emotions. It's real, it's authentic, and it's genuine. And it's a genuinely really lovely resolution. So I don't have any qualms with that, even if there are some lapses in logic. So that does redeem it a little bit to a 5 out of 10 for me, but that's as high as I'm willing to go. So those are my thoughts on Doctor Who Season 1, or Series 14, whatever the hell it's called. And here's my ranking of all the episodes, with me, Boom being at the top of the list, followed very closely by Dot and Bubble. Love those two. You can kind of tell that they were going to be at the top based on my opinions and my tastes. And then Space Babies at the bottom, and then Legend of Ruby Sunday, Empire of Death, Rogue in the bottom half of the list. And I think the thing is as well, even though it looks on this ranking like very polarised, like 50% great, 50% not very good. And yeah, it is true. It didn't feel that way when watching it, because there is that run from the Devil's Chord to Dot and Bubble. That was like 4-episode run where it's like really strong week in, week out. And because the Devil's Chord as well was broadcast the same as Space Babies, you could just kind of brush that one off, because it's like, okay, that week we still got, or me anyway, we still got a really great Doctor Who story. It was just those last couple of weeks that it just sort of filtered out for me, and I just wasn't really a fan personally. But yeah, I'd love to know what you guys think, but I've done a Doctor Who video in a little bit, and yeah, I forgot that the fandom isn't always great, and they can be very passionate. So please be sensible in the comments, please. But I'd love to know your rankings and what you thought of the series. What do you think of Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor? What do you think of Ruby Sunday? What do you think of Millie Gibson and whatnot? What do you think of any of the other elements, like any of the mysteries and the plot arcs and whatnot? And just let me know what you think of the series. Just please be respectful. That's all I ask. So with all that said, you take care, like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and you have a great day.